Now, South Africans should get a much-needed respite when government proposes the 5.2 billion rand relief to provide economic recovery and respite for fuel increases. And this in line, of course, with the National Treasury in the budget review, which says that increasing personal income taxes would have harmful effects on economic growth. Now, we heard Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana yesterday during his budget speech saying that there will be no bailout for state-owned enterprises. Since 2013, more than 308 billion rand had been channeled towards bailing out failing state-owned companies. So to discuss these and other matters, we're joined by Daniel McLaren, steering committee member of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is a collaboration of civil society organizations formed in 2018 to increase people's understanding, awareness and participation in South Africa's planning and budgeting processes. Thanks so much for your time, Daniel. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina. Thank you for having me.
So let's just start with your reaction to yesterday's budget speech. What did you make of what the finance minister delivered?
Well, look, of course, every budget is a balancing exercise, and coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is really the first post-crisis budget, we hope. On reflection, the members of the Budget Justice Coalition really feel quite strongly that this budget, following previous budgets, which really cut deeply into public service expenditure, so for example on health and education, really isn't what's required to lift us out of the acute social and economic crisis which we face, and paid very little reference to the dignity and rights of the majority of South Africans who continue to face inadequate public services which require significant investment after years of austerity. So we think that the kind of way that this budget continues to be balanced, both under Minister Mboweni and now under Minister Godongwana, is really far too heavily on the expenditure side. And we propose instead that we need to be much more effective in how we use the budget, but also where there are gaps in funding. If the government feels like we can no longer borrow from the financial markets, then we need to be asking the wealthier and more affluent South Africans to chip in at this point to pay for the difference.
So that, of course, has long been suggested, and that has long been balked at by government and, of course, those who may fall into that bracket, Daniel. But just in terms of the major shortcomings for the BJC, what would you say were those in the budget speech that was delivered yesterday?
So look, we have this 180 billion rand excess revenue over the 2021 budget predictions, and depending on which economist you talk to, we expect this revenue to continue at least for the medium term, and the budget does predict increased revenue for the medium term. And the way that revenue has been used has been partly for spending and partly for reducing public debt. And we would argue that given the extent of the social and economic crisis we face, which, after years of state capture and then the COVID-19 pandemic, we have 40% general unemployment, as I think all the viewers know by now, 50% unemployment for women and 60% unemployment for youth, and more than 50% of our population living at or below the poverty line. Therefore, the cuts to public service spending, which the budget implements, and to give you some concrete examples, the basic education budget is reduced in real terms every year of this budget, and the public health budget is reduced in real terms every year under this budget. That means that each year, for the next 3 years, and this follows a trend of the past two budgets under Minister Mboweni, the government will have less money to spend on public health services and less money to spend on education services, but not just those, other services as well. For example, early childhood development, something which almost any economist will tell you is one of the areas where you get the most bang for your buck in the budget. Every rand you spend there makes a huge difference both to the nutrition of children, the development of children, and also alleviating burdens on women in terms of childcare. And even that budget is cut. We think that those cuts are really too harsh. They're not the right tonic for our economy. And again, where there are gaps in funding, if we feel like we have over-leveraged ourselves as a country, then we should be asking the more affluent to come in and make sure that for this period, the Constitution to access these services to health and education maintained. And in the medium term, government needs to get its own house in order to make sure that the rands that we are allocating in the budget are being spent more effectively.
Is the fiscus over-leveraged as things stand at the moment, Daniel? Because if you look at the sort of borrowing that we have done only towards COVID, would you say that that money has been sufficiently spent? Do you think there's been sufficient oversight? And also just if you look at the transparency with which things have been done, how would you assess that?
Yes, well, this is, half of the solution is how do we finance the socioeconomic rights in our constitution? And we think there's a whole range of tax measures on the affluent and wealth that we could implement in that regard. The other side of it, as you say, is how have we spent the money? And enormous reforms are needed there to spend money more effectively. We've seen, the looting that's gone on in state-owned companies, which has reduced our transport system and our electricity system to a state where they are a drag on the entire economy. Those have to be fixed. We've got municipalities which are bordering on bankruptcy for a combination of mismanagement, but also lack of funding. So on the expenditure side, we need to be implementing reforms as a government, and we need to have vision, from everyone in government about how we're going to turn the quality of public services and spending around. And I think two areas that we would point to where, in terms of steps that we can take in this regard, we've got the Zondo reports coming out, and we have to see, I think every South African is going to be watching to see that the recommendations of those reports are implemented. People are held to account, and a message is sent that if you come into a government department and you do not do your job to oversee the expenditure of public money in a transparent and effective way, there will be consequences. And we need to implement those recommendations around improving our public procurement systems to try and make sure that corruption is minimized to the greatest extent possible. And then the second thing I think is really looking at the role of Parliament and our legislatures. Ultimately, they're responsible for passing the budget. The Minister of Finance doesn't pass the budget, he just tables the budget to Parliament. And therefore, Parliament has to approve of every single rand that is spent. And I'm talking both about national Parliament as well as our provincial legislatures. And there are opportunities for the public to make representations and to make sure that our parliaments are not sleeping, our parliamentarians, but are exercising proper oversight of the budget and are following through on their role to make sure that the money is being allocated and spent in the proper way.
So just to that final point in terms of the role of Parliament and the provincial legislatures and also public participation, to what extent is the public's input taken into consideration? Because you yourselves, as the BJC last year, you delivered your own alternative human rights budget with specific recommendations. So to what extent did that factor, would you say that was taken into consideration in this budget that the minister just tabled?
Well, we have seen some response from the National Treasury and from some parts of the government. So, for example, the BJC has been saying, the Budget Justice Coalition, that given the levels of gender inequality in our country, we need to see much more effort made in the budget to look at how spending decisions affect men and women differently. And much more analysis needs to be done of how women are affected by greater burdens of care, which aren't reflected in the economic statistics in the budget. And we need to see the Treasury in particular thinking about, when it makes budget decisions, how these are going to empower or disempower women, how they're going to reinforce the status quo or not. And we've seen the National Treasury, through the Director General, Dondo Makajane, recognize this in meetings actually this year. But unfortunately, when it comes to the budget itself, several colleagues in the Budget Justice Coalition have scanned this budget looking for initiatives to empower women, looking for funding for the National Strategic Plan against violence against women. And what they found is that the budget for the Department of Women, Children and Persons with Disabilities has been cut by 20% in this budget. And we therefore think that there's no surprise that the Minister did not speak to women's empowerment in the budget speech, because the hard fact of the matter is that this budget has been cut. Another thing we've been advocating for is for human rights in our constitution to be much more kind of central to how we think about budgeting. And I think the crucial thing here, Sakina, is, we don't have unlimited resources, and we obviously cannot just borrow and see our debt to GDP rising forever. However, when we are faced with an economic crisis, an acute fiscal crisis, as it's been described, we have to do everything we can to protect people's access to public services and the quality of those public services. And we're not seeing that level of protection being taken seriously in the budget. And really, our constitution requires the state to respect people's rights. And when money is cut and there isn't plans put in place to ensure, for example, that people still have access to basic healthcare services, children still have access to basic nutrition, and learners still have access to education, if the quality of all of those is being undermined, that is a problem in terms of our constitution. And the Budget Justice Coalition is looking at whether these cuts are justifiable given our progressive constitution, which requires the state to meet people's socioeconomic rights.
So if we take a look at a little bit more that came out of that budget speech yesterday, the minister says that before they were speaking about the funds, of course, there will be no funds used to bail out SOEs. But we know that about 308 billion rand has been spent on SOEs. And we saw earlier this week the remainder of the business rescue process funding for SAA, for example, another 3.5 billion rand, again, has been paid. So how is this benefiting the country? And what is the detriment of this to, social relief, as it were?
Yeah, no, it's had a huge impact. I mean, 300 billion rand is broadly similar to the total budget for basic education for one financial year. So, it's clear that in a number of respects over the past decade, there have been huge political failures in the state to hold people account, to appoint people in a regular way. And this has led to all kinds of problems at these huge, essentially too big to fail entities. And unfortunately, the decision has been taken to bail out these entities, but at the same time, those bailouts have come at a cost to social spending. And we always ask the question, why is it easy for the government to say that we have to spend another 3.5 billion rand on the SAA, but we at the same time, every billion rand that we spend on education or healthcare is put under the greatest scrutiny. And this decision around extending the 350 grant is the subject of so much contestation. We would see it from the other angle, saying that they're both necessary. And if in the medium term, if we are struggling to borrow more money, then the question is who will pay, and politically, who will pay as well for the failures in the state. So those are the questions that we would ask. And yeah, it's really not what our constitution envisages, that money is taken from maternity wards and childcare and early childhood development to bail out an airline which has been so poorly mismanaged over the last decade.
So just finally, if you look at the spending on social grants, for example, and we know that at this point, just about a third of the South African population receives some form of grant or another from government. And this, of course, has got many people totally in a flat spin, Daniel, for obvious reasons. But given the high unemployment rate, given where we find ourselves we're not even post-COVID, but as we come seemingly towards what seems to be the tail end of the pandemic, touch wood, where are we going? And should we be getting ourselves as a country in debt for this particular reason in order to make sure that we have enough money to provide enough of a social net?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's interlinkages here between the levels of inequality in our country, between the difficulty we've had in growing the pie, growing the economy, and the severe unemployment rate and poverty which people face. And it's not abnormal, Sakina, for half the population to have some form of social assistance. More or less every country in the world will provide child benefits, unemployment benefits. The question is, why do we would kind of want to see the conversation flip to an extent. We need fiscal sustainability, but we're the most unequal country in the world. Therefore, we don't think it's reasonable to say that the affluent in our country are paying too much, are paying enough, when it's clear that they still have access to far more resources than the majority of people. So social grants, rather than seeing them as a risk to the fiscus, we should really be seeing these as essential income for people in an economy in which you need rands in your pocket in order to survive, firstly. It's also a fundamental right that people have, access to social security. But thirdly, when we put money in people's pockets, and again, we're not unique in doing this, more or less every country in the world has made huge transfers into people's pockets to lift countries and economies out of the COVID-19 pandemic. When we do that, we give people the chance to spend money on their families, to feed themselves, to look for jobs, to start a small business, to start saving some money. These are the kind of things which income support provides. So yes, it must be financed in a sustainable way. We need to have that conversation. But we shouldn't be thinking of this as a drag, but as an opportunity to redistribute resources and give people a chance at lifting themselves out of poverty.
Yeah. Daniel, we're going to have to leave it there for this morning, but thank you so much for your time and your views there. Daniel McLaren is a steering committee member of the Budget Justice Coalition, giving us the coalition's response to yesterday's budget speech for the year 2022.